Good morning. I would like to call this meeting of the Board of Education Finance Committee meeting to order. The first item of the agenda is the election of the chair. I will ask for nominations for chairperson. We will vote once all nominations have been made and seconded. I have a nomination for chair. Ms. Karen.
I'll nominate John Zini.
Do we have any other nominations? Oh, sorry, second. Thank you, Dennis. Do we have any other nominations? All those in favor of electing John Zini for the position of Chair of the Finance Committee, please raise your hands. That is unanimous. Thank you very much. Congratulations, John.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you, everybody. So good morning. It's Thursday, November 17th, 2022. This is the Board of Education Finance Committee meeting. We hit the first agenda item, the election of the committee chairperson. So we're going to review the October 2022 financial report, which, as I understand it, has some more good news in terms of surplus.
Yep. So this is the financial report through October. We are now showing a positive balance of $565,731. So the change from September is $555,960. I'll go through the changes, but the biggest change relates to excess costs, which we'll go over in detail when we get to RC24. The first change is a shortfall in the guidance counselor account in MMS, and this is due to staff turnover, and that's deficit $12,736. A small positive balance in the paraprofessional account at Homes of $179. Staff turnover savings in the music account at Homes of just over $27,000. As we flagged at the last month's meeting, Tokenique is now anticipated to run elementary intramurals along with Homes, and so that's a shortfall of a change from $2,500. We did flag this as well at the last Finance Committee meeting. The Director of Health anticipated savings right now is $49,320 with an anticipated start date of December 1st. It's likely that'll grow a little bit more, as it'll probably be a little bit past December 1st, but we have slated it in as December 1st. The next one is one of the transfers for consideration, but we have a deficit in the water account of $5,900. Aquarian is hiking rates across the state of Connecticut, including ours, by about 13%. Those rate hikes are not anticipated to take effect until April. And so what you're seeing here is really just 3 months of those rate hikes, but you will see that in the budget that comes forward in January for a full year. The prorated savings of insurance for the Director of Mental Health is $10,243. We had staff turnover in the psychologist line item, which is adding to the budget and the deficit of $26,548. And then finally, excess cost is anticipated to be $516,806 better than the previous month. This is due to a lower threshold than anticipated. So the threshold was set at $104,310, which is 4.5 times our per pupil. We had budgeted $109,966, and so effectively we're picking up about $5,000 for every claim that we submit. So our first opportunity to submit claims is December 1st, so it's right around the corner. And then we'll have another submission on March 1st, which will then kind of finalize our submissions, and then we'll get the balance of the money right around then. And then we have, and that's another agenda item, created RC27. So you'll see all those safety and security positions and costs that we had originally flagged in the different school RCs in RC27. So just going through the general education RCs and the special education RCs, the general education RCs are forecasting a positive $248,181. Special education RCs are forecasting a total of $317,550 for that total of $565,731. Just going quickly through the RCs, as I mentioned earlier, the guidance counselor change of $12,736 in RC3. In RC7, the change is the music teacher for $27,117. In athletics, it's the addition of intramurals at Tokenique. So there's still a positive balance, but it's less of a positive balance from the previous month. In RC19, the Director of Mental Health has an assumed start date in this financial report of December 1st. And so that's a positive balance of $49,320. In excess costs, RC24. Originally, we were Sure. Positive balance of $378,007. So as I mentioned earlier, our threshold is now $104,310. So that gets issued at the end of October every year when they finalize the per pupil numbers. So we have an anticipated 59 claims to be submitted. So we're picking up an additional revenue of just over $330,000 because of that. And then we have an additional 11 claims that we're able to file in part because of the lower threshold, as well as just some additional changes to student cost. So as I stated in the previous ones, the new state budget does cap reimbursement at 70% based on town wealth. So that was a loss of revenue of $138,799, but we're picking up additional revenue because the change in the threshold of 516. And so you see that positive forecast now of 378,000 against budget. As I mentioned earlier, the psychologists are forecasted at a deficit of 26,548 due to staff turnover. RC 25, I mentioned earlier, the rate hikes from Aquarian. And again, this is just 3 months of what those rate hikes will be. And then the next budget will have to show the full year. We are still showing a deficit in the payroll tax account due to the Director of Security and SSOs. And we do have a pending transfer to discuss for that. And then in RC 27, which we'll discuss at another portion of the agenda, we have created tentatively, and assuming that the board supports it, and that RC will house the Director of Security, the SSOs, the campus monitors, what we call police and fire expenses, which is really the police we have for things like open house and graduation and moving up ceremonies, and then security materials.
Okay. Any questions?
Yeah, just,
Oh, sorry.
Dennis, go ahead.
okay, thanks, sorry. I can't see you. It's hard to see. So,
Understood. No worries.
just a question, Rich, on the excess cost, and just more of a education for me. So the threshold is set in October. That's not a number that's set yearly, or is that a new number based on the wealth that you mentioned it was
So
done last year?
So the threshold is set every year and it changes every year. So the district has to file, it's called an EFS report. It's the report that captures any expenditures that the Board of Ed has, any in-kind expenditures that the town provides to the Board of Ed. So an example of an in-kind expenditure are the SROs, it could be the crossing guards, things like that. So it doesn't hit your budget, but it affects your per pupil. That is due on September 1st. And then you have an audit period where the auditors go through it, determine if there's any essentially desk findings. And then the state issues what's called the per pupil expenditure in the end of October. And that per pupil expenditure is then 4 times by 4.5, and that sets your threshold. And so the things that affect that threshold are anything from expenses that you had, in-kind expenses that you had, grants that you spent, and then what they call average daily membership, which is effectively enrollment, but average daily membership is the average of your enrollment throughout the year. So it's not necessarily what you would see as that snapshot on October 1st, but if you had students who may have left during the year for whatever reason, that's captured in that. And so one of the things that affected our anticipated threshold was the average daily membership. We did see a drop in enrollment. And so our average daily membership was less than anticipated. And then the second factor is the federal grants that we received for COVID, the ARP ESSER grant. Part of that was for special ed recovery services and ESY services. And because those split over years, the bulk of those expenditures actually hit this year as opposed to last year. And so that dropped some of our expenditures, which then again lowered our threshold.
Sounds like a lot of moving variables you have to account for. Just
That was the point I was going to make, Dennis. I mean, it's almost like a black box going into October. I mean, it's really difficult to forecast.
So usually when we come up with an assumed threshold, we're looking at what the last approved threshold is. We take an assumption of what our budget's going to be approved at. So usually we look at, that 3 or 4%, let's say that it's going to be, and then that's what we assume for our daily, for our actual threshold, unless we see things like variables, like we know we're going to have declining enrollment, or you're going to have increasing enrollment, or whatever it might be.
so again, for next year, since we won't have the grants, I'm assuming, and maybe this is too early, but we'll probably go back up towards the 109 number versus a 104 number.
So right now we're set at the 104. And so we would anticipate your threshold going somewhere above 104, probably in the 3 to 5%.
Okay.
Part of it will depend on what enrollment looks like. And then we have a little bit of grant money left. And so that'll affect it as well.
Okay. Yeah. Realize we'll discuss this more in the winter. So, okay. Thanks.
That was my question. But can you answer?
So it was a little over 101,000. So typically the jump is, 3 to 4%. The year in which the district got the $1 million for the ARP ESSER grant, as well as some special education COVID grant, it actually jumped 7%. And the reason was we got a significant amount of grant money that's abnormal to the district. And so that 1 year we did have a approximately 7% increase, but typically it goes up 3 to 4% a year.
Thank you.
And I guess I wanted to highlight a couple items. I mean, just to be clear, this surplus accounts for the cost of both the mental health director implementation and the school security effort implementation.
The prorated
Yeah,
portion.
for the half years,
Yep.
if you will. Now, one thing that did come up in the Board of Finance meeting discussions and the back and forth with questions were benefits associated with the SSO or the school, let's just call it the school security effort. Now, we do account for benefits for the director of security in our forecast, but we have zero forecasted in benefits for the school security officers. So it's a tough agenda to kind of fit that question in. So I want to do it now. But if we were to assume on a conservative basis that all 6 school security officers were to take benefits, which, as I understand, we are required to offer benefits, although other school districts that have this model in place, they did not take the benefits for various reasons. Maybe walk us through the additional cost of that effort and how it would affect the budget, this year's budget going forward.
So just to kind of go over when we determine whether or not to budget benefits or not. So we have about 800 employees within the district. We have about 585 employees who do take benefits. So we obviously have a number of employees who don't. We make certain assumptions about whether an employee will take benefits, just like we make assumptions about staff turnover. And so the idea is that if you were to budget every employee in the district for benefits, the district would probably need about $5 million more than we budget. And then every year you'd be giving back essentially $5 million back to the town for no reason. So we make certain assumptions about certain groups of employees and whether they will take it. For the SSOs, for health insurance alone, it would be about $66,000.
For all 6?
For all 6,
okay.
correct.
For a half a year?
For a half a year. And so we are fully insured, and so we pay premiums. And so the anticipation is that you would pay 6 months of those premiums for every SSO. And so that's about $66,288. Life insurance and LTD, long-term disability, are pretty minor. It's about $750 for all 6 SSOs. The one caveat in the change is the retirement. And so right now, all non-certified employees go into the town pension. And so when an employee, and it's pretty rare that we have like a non-certified employee during the mid-year. If we do, it's typically either a para, whether it's an instructional para or a special education para. There is no actual expense to the board in that first year for their pension costs. It gets picked up in the following year when the actuary does their analysis of what contribution for a number of factors, market returns, the number of employees, age, et cetera. And then you pick up that new pension contribution the following year. If the SSOs were to go into a 401A style plan, and a 401A is essentially the municipal version of a 401K.
Defined contribution.
Correct. And so right now there's a handful of people on the town side who do have a 401A, and it's set up with essentially a 555 format where the employee puts in 5%, the employer matches 5%, and then it takes them 5 years to vest to get that match. So 5% of the 6 months of salary, or assume 6 months of salary for the SSOs, would be $9,300 in total for all 6. So if they are to go, that would be a direct cost that we would have to forecast and budget, because that would be an expense that we were to pick up. But in total, across all 3, you'd be looking at about $76,000. Again, the odds of any of the SSOs taking health insurance are probably small.
Why is that?
So by statute, they do have to be retired police officers in good standing. Not necessarily from the town that you're in, but they could be NYPD, they could be in Westport or New Canaan, it could be anywhere throughout the area. Most police officers retire with benefits. So we did reach out prior to putting the forecast together to Newtown, Monroe, and then Easton, Reading, because those are the 3 districts that have had SSOs for a long period of time. And in all those districts, none of those SSOs actually took health insurance benefits. The one reason we did put in for the director of security is there wasn't necessarily a requirement to be a retired law enforcement officer. It was preferred, but you could have gotten somebody who maybe worked for the Department of Homeland Security or a security consultant. And so if you were a security consultant and you're leaving and you're coming to a job like this, odds are better that you're going to end up taking health insurance benefits.
So the director of security, we've assumed benefits, but when it comes to retirement, are we assuming a pension participation?
So we are assuming a town pension for the director of security.
Okay, but will a 401A be available to that person should they decide to want to?
If they would prefer a 401A, then that would be available.
Okay.
And then we would have to pick up essentially that 5% of the prorated salary.
So that in that case, unlikely given the defined contribution differences between defined benefits such as a pension defined contribution, but there's a possibility that retirement cost could come down versus projected.
Correct.
Okay. So I guess the issue that I'm trying to get at is from an accounting budgeting purpose. You know, we tend to budget conservatively, and hence we tend to have some surpluses as we budget conservatively. Is this a case where we should at least be putting some of the components into the transfers that we're going to be considering and into the forecasted budget for the year?
So I would probably think if we think the SSOs are going to be more in that 401A style, I would think for the next financial report, we would pick up the retirement cost. Because at that point, there is no December Finance Committee meeting because there's only one board meeting.
Okay.
So the next opportunity is January. The hope is that we would have those, those people employed at that time. And then you would see that forecast for retirement benefits. And I think that would firm up at that point. You would be picking up about, $9,300, as I mentioned before. And then if the director didn't take benefits, health insurance benefits, then you'd actually almost have a wash to a positive scenario. And then you would see that in the forecast. If we were to include the whole $76,000 that I represented, instead of being at $565,000, you'd be about $489,000 to the positive. My recommendation in the memo that I sent out the other day would be to recommend transfers to the salaries and then the materials and the uniforms that we had talked about now. And then in January, when we have the next financial report, which is through December, if there are benefits associated that we have to pick up, then we can have a secondary transfer because we are still sitting on at least enough money that you could cover it.
Okay, and I want to focus on the financials, but I guess the way I'm looking at it also, there's other implications of the benefits that we offer in terms of who we can hire. And without getting into the weeds too much, but from what I understand, there's certain benefits that we would need to offer to hire local retired police officers for the SSO.
Correct. So if there are, if they are Darien employees, so Darien Police Department employees, they would have to go in a 401A. They could not go back into the town pension because once they retire as a police officer, they're drawing their pension as part of being a police officer. So those employees would have to go to a 401A. If you were to hire an employee from, Westport or the NYPD or New Canaan or wherever, they're not restricted by those same requirements.
Okay, it's almost like the double dip concept. Correct. If I'm not, and again, with the retired officers, we're talking
Correct. They have to be retired officers.
Okay. So I guess, my recommendation would be a bit bigger board discussion because it does have implications. And, I think through budgeting, you had no intention of signaling the exclusion of certain individuals in the hiring pool, if you will. We were just budgeting based on your best estimates of cost.
Correct. So
Okay.
if you're a full-time employee, we are required to offer insurance, and then you're also required to offer affordable insurance to 95% of your employees due to the Affordable Care Act. So excluding the benefits wasn't that they were not going to get benefits. It was more along the lines of how we do assumptions when we actually budget benefits for the entire population of employees.
Okay, perfect.
I guess if you include it now, it's potentially then maybe make an adjustment the other way.
Yeah. And so Richard's recommendation makes sense to me in that it's 1 or 2 months of maybe a gap in certain budgeting, but given the likelihood, we're not going to see this 76,391 hit. We were welcomed with most awesome budget surplus news going into this meeting through the discussion that you guys had with the Board of Finance. So my recommendation to the board and to the rest of the committee would be to follow Rich's lead on this. But no later than the January finance report that you make the adjustments on any additional costs that are tied to the SSOs.
Yes, so once we obviously would know who the employees are, the adjustment would also be in salary. So if they don't start, let's say January 3rd and they start the 10th or whatever it might be, you might have a little bit of downward movement there. We'll pick up any benefits if somebody elects or not.
Okay, and if you could just summarize this for a discussion with the board on Tuesday night when we go through the transfers and just hopefully they're watching this most enlightening meeting, but all joking aside, I think, if we kind of lay it out like that, it'll be very clear that, what there might be potential extra costs in this budget cycle. But as you pointed out, even if we took the most aggressive assumption in adopting the expenses tied with the hiring of the SSOs, your our budget surplus for this year is going to move from 565 to 489, right? Is what you're telling me. So, if we were running closer to the sun in terms of, I would probably want to include it sooner, but I think we have a little leeway in timing on that. Go ahead.
This is a change from what was originally discussed at previous meetings.
You're off, actually. Yeah, there you go.
Thank you. I was just confirming that this proposal is a change from what was originally discussed in terms of adding these FTEs and going through an appropriation process that would be done more formally to the Board of Finance and to the RTM. Is that correct?
So we did have a Board of Finance meeting on this past Tuesday, and we had a discussion about how to fund the SSOs and the Director of Security. Their recommendation was for the Board of Education to look at possibly approving transfers to fund the SSOs and the Director of Security. And if, as the year progresses, if things go significantly different than we're anticipating, potentially come back to them with the explanation of what significantly changed. So it's now up to the Board of Education as to whether or not they want to approve transfers to fund the SSOs and the Director of Security. And then obviously if they fund them, they'll be part of the revised budget. If you choose not to approve the transfers, then it's another discussion about whether or not to go back for the appropriation or if the proposal doesn't go forward.
Yeah, and let me give you a little bit of background. So in our last finance committee, you did include, that was the first time that you include the let's just call it the security department costs into our budget.
Correct.
In which, so at that meeting a month ago, we were running basically just shy of a $10,000 surplus with the school security department, if you will. The new incremental costs associated that in that financial report. And again, you did that for conservatism's sake. If we did not receive an appropriation, what would the finances look like? So fast forward to this week, or the last board meeting, or 2 board meetings ago, I believe that the Board of Education voted to pursue a special appropriation from the Board of Finance and the RTM. If you watch Tuesday's meeting, there was a robust discussion, just like we just had, about the Board of Education surplus, which is running well over $500,000. And as I read in the motion, there was tremendous support personally from each member of the Board of Finance, but they did not move that motion. So the motion did not carry. So now we are sitting here as a board deciding on how we would finance the SSOs. And so what I think we're moving into a next agenda item, but that's what we're going to be discussing, whether or not we are going to be recommending to the Board of Education to finance the security department, Director of Security, and the SSOs through our budget surplus. Is that pretty correct?
And even though we're now taking the expense into our own budget, the meeting that's happening on November 30th with the RTM committees is still going forward. We're still going to educate the RTM on the initiative because it will be coming next year.
Yeah, and just
But
so,
without an appropriation, they won't have a vote.
correct.
Correct.
So, but just one caveat, there are capital items which were approved by the Board of Finance in which the RTM will also vote on. So any capital item must be approved through that process, through special appropriations outside the budget process. Is that correct? So there will be a discussion about the capital items, and Sarah, you were there, but I think the discussion was, or whoever spoke, there was a discussion about having an informational session about the operational.
Correct. Yeah, which is happening November 30th.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay. Any other questions regarding the 2022 financial report, which again, we just kind of drifted into the budget transfers. So let's go there, I guess.
So originally we had a proposed one budget transfer. We did send an amended document out yesterday with an additional 4. So we'll go over all 5. I'll start with the one that was initially in the board packet, which is to fund the projected deficit in water. As I mentioned earlier, Aquarian is increasing rates across Connecticut for our water starting in April. So there is a request to transfer $5,921 into the water account. And we are recommending taking savings from the principal turnover at Royal of $2,146, and then savings from unaffiliated salary increases and contract support for $3,775.
Okay. Let's take these transfers one at a time today, if we could. Is it the committee's intent to recommend this transfer to the board? Not, we're not talking SSOs yet, just this water transfer.
Makes sense to me, yeah.
Dennis?
Yep.
Okay, so consensus, we'll bring that forward with a recommendation.
Okay, so the next 4 transfers relate to the security proposal for the director of security and the SSOs. We are breaking them out between the director, the SSOs, and then associated benefits related to payroll taxes and materials. So the first is for funding a prorated portion of the director of security. That's anticipated to be $48,764. Currently, we have an unfilled section at Holmes in grade 4. So that salary is sitting there for $48,764.
And just to be clear, that unfilled section is due to enrollment. Okay. Okay. Again, so we'll take them separate. I think it's helpful. So any comments or questions on the director of security transfer?
No.
So it would be, okay, go Katie. Sorry.
Yeah, I just have concerns about cutting the appropriation process. I think that the process of introducing them happened rather quickly. And I understand that the board had significantly more time to discuss and come to where it was at. I was on the town side during that. The town had significantly less so. So I am less comfortable with this transfer and would be more comfortable going through the original appropriation process.
So you do not recommend this budget transfer would occur to support the director of security?
Correct. I'd rather go through the process originally laid out.
I guess we don't have control of the process outside the Board of Education. So that would mean what?
That would mean that the other boards, including the Board of Finance and the RTM, would have a chance to weigh in.
The Board of Finance just had a meeting this week,
But
right?
the RTM has,
But the Board of Finance didn't forward it, so it doesn't go to the RTM.
Yeah, it doesn't go to the RTM.
Board of Finance has already said that they are not.
isn't that what we just said, though, that the RTM would have had a vote on it?
So,
Yeah, but the Board of Finance has to approve it, and then
Appropriation.
so yeah, let me be clear.
it's like the Senate and the Congress and the Senate. You can't move one without the other.
Yeah, so the Board of Finance did not move forward with the special appropriation. So that means we have to find a way to fund it if we still support the program. So we cannot just jump the Board of Finance to go to the RTM. That's not part of the process. So
No, that I understand. I guess I didn't realize that Tuesday's meeting was their one chance to have the appropriation. I thought that was already ahead of schedule. So my apologies for misunderstanding that.
yeah, Mr. Chairman,
Thank you for the question.
Microphone.
We committed a while ago, Jack and I and the RTM subcommittees to do an information session, regardless of how this process played out. So November 30th, with the help of Jack and those RTM Education, RTM F&B, and RTM
Public health and safety.
Public Safety are coming together, and we're going to have an information session about all that we're doing from a security protocol standpoint, as much as we can in a public session. So what I committed to the other night at the Board of Finance as this process worked through is that we'll continue with that meeting. They've got the appropriation from a capital standpoint for the door sensors, but we'll continue to educate them and have the informational session around the other security protocols that we're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I guess logistically, we could go back to the Board of Finance and ask them again, but that would delay the process.
There's no point in going back to the Board of Finance. The Board of Finance is incredibly supportive. This makes sense financially based on the way the budget has changed, and it's within our purview to pay for it out of our budget. So, and I can tell you from previous experience, if needed, as we go through the rest of the year, the Board of Finance will be there for us for an appropriation.
So, I guess, my feelings on this is I fully support the program because we're running such a large budget surplus, and the budget surplus kind of grew and grew and grew up until literally this week. Financially, I personally don't see a need for a special appropriation. Now, remember, this is only for a half year and we're filling it over the next semester. As discussed at the Board of Finance meeting, this will be baked into next year's budget, and every town body will have a say in how, if they want to fund this or not from an operational standpoint.
Well, that's true, kind of.
Why is that?
Well, you can't, no one has line item veto. So if we decide to do this and we'll continue forward, they can't pull it out. Right?
They can pull the funding.
They could pull a funding, but they can't pull the funding for a specific item, and they can only go back to last year's budget versus what we proposed for 2023-24.
Understood. Thank you.
Just to be clear.
Thanks for the clarification. Appreciate that. So hearing kind of description, do you have any other questions or comments? Okay. And it's a good meeting, actually. I watch it in pretty thorough discussion over their thought process around our budget surplus. And again, they only look into the finances, if you will, but they did express some personal views on the security program implementation. Dennis, anything? So we're back to, again, does this committee have a consensus to recommend this transfer to the Board of Education?
Yeah, for me, I fully support moving it forward and funding it ourselves. I understand Mrs. Lublin's concerns that, the process is kind of I don't want to say went off the rails, but did a detour. But this is the way government works. And if we had we known we had the money, we would not have gone for an appropriation. We would have funded it ourselves from the beginning. I understand the point that we wanted to go through an appropriation, but that was because we didn't think we had the money. So I think we always try to fund things that we can with our own money and not ask for more taxpayer money than necessary.
Yeah, I'll just tag on to those comments. If you watch the surplus develop, throughout the year, it grew basically every finance report. So when these discussions started, over the summer, Dr. Adams? Yeah. We were looking at a brand new budget with no surplus, if you will. So, granted, we could have pivoted, last month, but we were running pretty tight. I mean, only about
under 10,000.
Yeah. So, I think that's why, I don't want to speak for the board, but I think that's why the board went via the appropriation process. It also offers some other town bodies that kind of have a say, but it was unnecessary by the time we got to Tuesday night. And so
I think it's fair to say that it was late. The new news for this meeting was new news, and it certainly had to be disclosed in the bigger picture. But
yeah, no, I appreciate again, I joked with Rich before the meeting, we didn't have to have the meeting because you went through the surplus issues with the Board of Finance. But okay, so I also fully support the transfer. So I'm seeing a consensus, and we'll move that forward as well. And if you at the board meeting want to discuss some of your questions there, you can do that there. And so then the third transfer would be for basically 6 school security officers. And Rich, if you could run us through that.
Sure. So it is to fund the prorated portion for the 6 school security officers of $187,000. The areas from taking the funding would be the balance of the unfilled section at homes due to enrollment for $6,600. The staff turnover savings for the music teacher that we referenced earlier of $27,000. The unfilled section at Royal due to enrollment of $66,000. The unfilled section at Hindley in grade 2 due to enrollment for $72,000. And then the savings from unaffiliated salary increases of just over $13,000.
Okay, and again, any of these positions, these were due to enrollment issues, and not because we couldn't hire anybody. Okay, So kind of same question. Do I have a consensus from this committee to recommend this transfer?
Yeah, just one question on this. So with the surplus from the extra excess cost, we're still looking at having a surplus even after these budget transfers, correct?
Correct. Yeah, I mean, you're again, as stated, this $565,000 surplus fully accounts for the implementation of the school security plan. Okay, so that will not get reduced by what are we talking, 200?
Right, just clarifying to make sure.
Already in the forecast.
That was already in the forecast last budget cycle to budget update last month, which got us to $10,000.
So if you were to think about it, the budget surplus would be closer to $800,000 without putting the SSOs and the director of security in. And then when you put it back in, it comes down to the 565.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
No, I think it's
Okay.
great.
Any other comments? Okay, so seeing a consensus, we'll bring that forth, that recommendation on the transfer to the broader board. The next agenda item is creation of RC 27, safety and security, and other possible line item modifications. So
So we had talked about creating at the last meeting, a new RC that would house safety and security. So we have tentatively created RC 27, which will be safety and security. The idea would be to put the director of security there, the armed school security officers. We would then move the campus monitors that are currently allocated throughout the school's RC. So RC 1, 3, 5, 7, 8, 9, and 10. The associated materials associated with security that are currently in RC 12. And then police and fire, which you'll currently see in the schools RCs. And again, that's for things like graduation and moving up ceremonies, open house nights. It's also fire duty if you have a certain amount of people having, let's say, a play or a theater program. And so the recommendation would be to create that RC 27, which would house those items. We also talked about if there are any other items that we would potentially want to consider changing. So we did add 2 for consideration. One would be to move the assistant principals that are currently in RC 24 to the respective schools. So when we created the special education assistant principals, it was essentially a trade-off of the CES facilitators. And so we are recommending that the assistant principals for special education go into the schools, in part because they're not just doing special education, while their primary focus is special education, is not just solely special education. And then the third and final one is the district has an art coordinator, and for a number of years, for whatever reason, even though it's a K-12 position, has been coded to just the middle school in curriculum supervision. And since we do have an art RC 14, excuse me, the recommendation would be to move that release time associated with the art coordinator to RC 14 art.
anybody have a question?
This all seems to make sense to me. I just have a question about the titling of the assistant principal. Will still be called a special education assistant principal, or was it just being
It would be in the assistant principal.
Yeah, okay, because I mean, as it says in here, it's not just special education. Correct.
Just to follow up on the question, when you look at their roles, and I know this is probably an unfair question, but if you were to divide their time versus being a, focused on special ed versus other time, do you have any kind of estimate, or is that just an unfair question?
At this particular time, that's not an unfair question, but it's an interesting question because with Connecticut SEDS and so on and so forth, I'll just tell you that our assistant principals and special education staff across the state at the moment are the preponderance of their time is on special education, particularly for one of those special education teachers. So we would be trying to split that and give some assistance from the other assistant principals, which is what we said we were doing, and we are doing some of it now. But this sort of make sure that's what's conveyed
And it's accounted for properly. Okay. So, Dennis, any questions?
Yeah, so my question is not about the creation of the RC, because I think I agree with that. My question is, and maybe this is a broader discussion of the board, is I struggle with separating out security officers, and yet psychologists and art teachers are lumped into the schools. So to me, I think we need to be consistent, and I'm not sure we're being consistent here. So to me, the psychologist should go into health, the art teacher should go into art, the music teacher goes into music, and it sums up that way if we're doing security as its own special RC. So I think, to me, I'm in favor of going that way, but if we pull out RC, if we pull out the security in RC 27, why do we keep art in the schools and not in the art RC, and vice versa? If we have the art people in, then the security should roll into the schools, I think.
So the
Just a point.
downside with doing that is you don't get a truer picture of what the individual school will cost when you start pulling out, teaching staff. And so there's not necessarily a right way or a wrong way to do it. Like if you look at some districts, all special education staff, for example, are in the schools, and they don't have any staff except central office staff in an RC, the equivalent of an RC 24. Some do it the way we do it, similar like New Canaan as an example. They have the equivalent of an RC 24. They also have what's called a pupil services budget in addition to an RC 24. And that house things like psychologists, social workers, guidance counselors, and things like that. I think that it would be more beneficial in terms of things like art and music that you referenced, that they would be in the schools. I will say when we do the EFS report, which we talked about earlier, we do have to code them to the individual schools in order to submit that to the state. They do want to know, how many art teachers do you have? How many music teachers do you have at a respective school?
Okay, no, it's fair. I understand. I just, for me, I like consistency, and this just irks me in a way where it doesn't seem consistent. I appreciate your points, Rich. I do. So
We're consistently inconsistent is what you're saying. Any other?
Is there just hearing that New Canaan has with our increased emphasis on wellness and mental health and the resources that we're supporting there, is there a benefit to creating an RC that
As
encompasses all
pupil
of that?
services.
Yeah.
So you would end up getting rid of things like the health RC, for example. So a pupil services RC would have your psychologist, your health supervisor, your nurses, your guidance counselors, things like that. There's no positive or negative necessarily to have it. It's just more a matter of preference as to whether or not you want to see those in a school or not in a school. And the one difference is it kind of separates out what's special ed versus what's a pupil service.
So, Mr. Chairman, I think for this one, we were just looking at, obviously recommended the security to come out, say obviously, but that was the main recommendation. And then was there any that sort of fell out that seemed just to make sense? It would be a much bigger discussion and changing a lot of other line items around budget season and other things. I'm not so sure that's, well, it's not what we're recommending at this point, but certainly to Mr. Maroney's point and others, there are other things that could be changed, but it's a question whether you want to do we really want to go through all that and do that, particularly at this particular time,
Might be a little late.
as we are just in the middle of RC line items and budget and so on.
No, go ahead. What'd you say, Dennis?
No. I totally understand Dr. Adley's point, and my point is, I think, and I'm not going to put words into Mrs. Parent's mouth, but I think my point is, I like separating out, especially when we have new initiatives like this. I like separating out the RC security, and to me, what Mrs. Parent was saying about mental health, and to me, I'd like to begin to separate some of that out so we can see what that cost is as an RC, as opposed to then trying to pull it out of each individual school, where I think it gets a lot more difficult to do.
So might I suggest that this is going to be a longer conversation if there's some other adjustments potentially on some of these budget line items, but we're not going to tackle that today, right, Dennis?
No, totally agree. It's
Perfect. Thank you. No, they're valid comments. And, also I like the move on the assistant principal side, because I think there's been public comment about perhaps overloading the RC on special ed and maybe unfairly representing the cost of service, the special ed department. So I think that moves in the right direction, especially if their roles are hybrid and serve the schools directly. So I'm in favor of that as well. So I think we go with recommendations on this with some commentary as well.
agreed.
All right, thank you. I guess we are moving now to public comment. There's no one here unless Ms. McCammon has a public comment.
So for the
Just recommending.
Well, can we hear the question?
so you technically don't have to vote for a shift in a line item, as long as they stay within their actual broad categories. There probably should be a consensus, just as we had a consensus for the COVID RC as to whether or not you want an RC 27. though.
If I use the board vote, it was misplaced. Thank you. But we recommend, that we have a consensus that your recommendation makes sense. Okay, public comment, please.
Ms. Deb Ritchie, you are recognized and unmuted. You will have up to 3 minutes to comment.
Good morning. My name is Deborah Ritchie. I live at 16 Stony Brook Road South. Full disclosure, I am the co-chair of CDSP. These comments are my own. A little shocked about the discussion regarding security since I don't see it in the packet. Maybe I missed it. I'm not sure. I only see one transfer, and that was for the rate increase for water. So those of us who are watching the meeting today didn't have time to review that. Hopefully you'll have a full discussion at the board. And from what I can understand from your discussion, it sounds like the Board of Finance did not support the appropriation going forward, even though it sounds like they didn't technically vote on it. That's a little concerning too. My procedural comment is when you voted to support the security, the Director of Security and the SSOs, you voted for a special appropriation. You did not vote separately for these positions. So I hope next week we will see something on the agenda that's a separate vote supporting these FTEs, if that's the intention. Thank you.
Thank you.
There are no more raised hands.
So could I get a motion for adjournment?
So moved.